Salutations and welcome to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alex F., and today on the podcast, we are so excited to welcome scholar, author, editor, and legendary esoteric authority, Joseph Peterson. Okay, this interview was a rare opportunity, and it was a true pleasure. And I say that Joseph Peterson is legendary because if all roads lead to Rome, then just so, any ceremonial magician or grimoire researcher, if they're worth their salt, will eventually be led to and experience and benefit from Joe's many definitive editions of translated and edited religious and esoteric texts. Some examples that I know you're familiar with include the Lemegeton or the Lesser Key of Solomon, the Sworn Book of Honorius, the Grimoire Verum, the Arbidel. I mean, the list goes on and on among many of Joe's classical and Renaissance texts that he has published and issued. And after years of collecting and digitizing rare texts for his own research, in 1995, Joe created the Avesta.org and EsotericArchives.com websites to share these kind of publications with a wider audience. So if you haven't checked those out yet, you might not be one of the 3 million document requests, that's right, 3 million per month, that the websites have seen. So Joe's also an incredibly busy guy. He's basically tackling the great work every single day by furthering research and editing and discovering and restoring many fragmented and hitherto unknown esoteric and religious texts. And so I was so thankful for this rare opportunity to speak with Joe. So stay tuned in this episode because Joe shares about what it really takes to do serious esoteric research, his own personal spiritual practice, how magic and religion intertwine, Zoroastrianism, grimoire magic in the light of a dualistic approach to the universe, and so many more topics. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Joseph Peterson. Joseph Peterson, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure to get a chance to talk with you.
The honor is truly ours, Joe, because I know that you're incredibly busy and you're constantly outpouring such amazing new discoveries and new texts and analysis for the occult and esoteric community. And I think I'm quoting Aaron Leach correctly when he called you, quote, the man on this subject. So, Aaron, if you're listening, I promise I'm trying not to take you out of context. You've been studying esoteric texts for decades, and I think a lot of listeners might be curious to know, was this an interest that you always had from a very young age, or when was the actual genesis of your interest in the occult? When did that first come about?
I was fairly young, probably in the 8 to 10 range, and I've spent a lot of time at the library studying many topics, and this is one of them that I came across that always fascinated me. So, wow. Along with languages and ancient cultures. Approximately how many different languages are you fluent in, conversational in, can translate in? I mean, it just seems like you are, it's just incredibly versatile, the amount of texts that you put out all the time. Well, I can read and write more of them than I can actually speak and follow a fluent native speaker. I'm pretty good with French and Italian. I'm probably most comfortable with Latin, although the only place I ever speak that is at the Medieval Congress. I'm also pretty good with the Vestan language, which is a sister language to Sanskrit. Persian and German I studied in college as well, and Russian. Although the Persian and Russian are kind of rusty at this point because I haven't used them that much. I think that covers most of them. That is incredible. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, that also on YouTube, there are a few videos of you reciting Zoroastrian prayers before dinner, before meals, and a certain other things, and it's very beautiful. Is that right? Well, I try to use the recordings that I've collected from different priests for most of the YouTubes. The Grace Before Meals was one that I hadn't seen anybody else recorded, so I took the opportunity of recording it and adding that there because it was requested a couple of times. So
I believe it was Dr. Skinner who, in one of the introductions to his Source Works on Ceremonial Magic series, mentioned that, for 100 years, magicians and ceremonial researchers, esoteric researchers, were pretty much bound by the Mathers and the Crowley editions of the Lemegeton and the Goetia and, very early texts and translations. And then it was in 2001 when the Lesser Key of Solomon, when your definitive edition came out. It was such a groundbreaking thing, and multiple people have told me that because for the first time in that particular text, the kind of edition from the early 1900s was eclipsed, and it was updated with incredible annotations and analysis. Can you just kind of talk about a little bit about where you first kind of felt that pull, that motivation to look at these old texts and say, these need to be updated. There's so much more here. Can you kind of just share a little bit about that?
Well, I actually started on the records that John Dee kept of his various mystical experiments and scrying experiments, because those had not been published at all. So I went and actually spent a summer at the British Library, British Museum. I got special permission from their board of trustees to use the manuscript room and studied those firsthand. And I wanted to create a printed edition of it for my own purposes, if nothing else, simply because the handwriting is very difficult. Some of the worst handwriting in any manuscripts I've seen. When he was recording the sessions, he'd write incredibly fast, and then he would follow up with a more carefully written exemplar. But then some of the manuscripts were damaged, and others complement each other. And so I wanted to put together, something that's readable and searchable for my own purposes. I also, at that same summer, researched other texts, including the Lesser Key, and at that time there had only been the one that Mathers put together and never printed of the Goetia, and then Crowley had it printed. So I wanted to complement that with the larger set of texts that was included in those manuscripts. Let me also just take the opportunity to say that I don't think that the Mathers editions of either of those texts are eclipsed or obsoleted, because he was a very well-respected practicing occultist that had a lot of influence to this day. So I think his views on and editions are still influencing practice worldwide. So hopefully it's complementing his text to be able to add some further details based on my research.
One of the many journeys, and you just referenced this, that you're constantly embarking on is this kind of discovery and translating and conducting actual archival research of esoteric texts. Now, for the totally, rookie, uninitiated guy like me, when I hear that, there's some new manuscript out there that yourself or Dr. Stephen Skinner have located and is working on, in my head, I see you almost like a secret agent. You're sneaking into the catacombs of the Vatican at midnight. You're paying off some wayward priest for access to the most guarded manuscripts of the ages, or you're somewhere in the greater Mediterranean area spending hours evading prying eyes in some kind of, dusty library with a magnifying glass. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but in reality, you've gone on some pretty amazing researching journeys, both internal and external. So can you kind of share with our listeners about the actual process of actually going through locating and working with these historic documents?
Well, it's a lot easier now with so many centers that have digitization projects, and you can often find things by being persistent in how you search the online digital archives. This is still a big problem. There are so many challenges with how the libraries catalog the different manuscripts and materials that they have. It's a big problem even to this day. For one example, I was searching for a dictionary that was done of the Zoroastrians in the Yazd area. They have a unique dialect that is almost extinct now, and a dictionary was published probably 100 years ago, something like that. Searching for it, I found 65 different ways of spelling the title in worldcat.org. So these are trained librarians who are supposedly given some guidelines as far as how to transcribe different manuscripts in different languages and title pages and creating the metadata for it. And it's also changing, so their job is, more complicated every day. But just being able to find the material in the various cataloging systems is the first challenge. Most of this stuff is locked away because it's so fragile. With the British Library, I needed to get special permission from the trustees just to touch the manuscripts. So that's a barrier to scholarship if you have to actually go to see the material. And sometimes the photographs are actually better now than the manuscript because they were taken, 20 years ago. The microfilms I have from, it's like 40 years now, from 40 years ago, are much clearer than the manuscripts in some respects. And that's also the case with a lot of the rare Avestan texts and manuscripts. But aside from that, once you locate it, many times the research facility will have a service for taking photographs for you. And this is how it started with me. I was able to make some photocopies from some materials in Minneapolis, but that's a very bad practice because it can be potentially damaging to the source work, so you have to be very careful. But since then, they have overhead scanners, and the practice of filming with microfilm with overhead cameras is a solution that was kind of state-of-the-art at that time. So I would just submit orders to the British Library or the other archives for photos of the manuscripts. And frequently someone else had requested microfilms of a particular manuscript, and rather than send me just that one particular text, they ran the whole spool through. So if the original requester had 3 or 4 different texts on a spool, they'd send me all 4 of them, and because it was easier for them. And so I found a lot of texts I had not considered just that way. I've arranged to visit a couple of archives directly because they had no facility to take photographs. This is the case with the University of Utah with one of the Sibley texts that I used for the Sibley's Clavis edition. They were gracious enough to let me photograph it with my own equipment. I also went to Toronto for my latest project I'm working on, kind of interesting, is this Proto-Grimorium Verum text, which is an ancestor to that. And I've tracked down a number of copies, and I've actually found a catalog reference to a manuscript existing in Gerald Gardner's library. When he died, his personal library went to Ripley's Museum. They picked up all of his artifacts and books and manuscripts and stuff, and they sold it to the Jameses, who are the founders of the Wiccan Church of Canada in Toronto. So the description of it in the catalog, there's a very brief catalog of all of the texts there, led me to suspect that it was actually another exemplar of this text that I'm working on. So I exchanged some emails with him, and he confirmed that, yes, it was, in fact. So I packed up my digital scanner and drove up there and spent a week working with him and his wife, and we got the whole thing scanned in and digitized, and was able to incorporate that then into my critical apparatus for this particular text. So that was probably one of the more interesting ones. Another text for this same book, I found a reference in a couple of places to this State Archive of Venice having a copy, and it was the archives of the Inquisition, the Venetian Inquisition, and I kind of got a little bit of a runaround because I was confused with the way it was referenced in this Italian source, and I thought it was in the Vatican Secret Archives, which is also ASV abbreviation. I spent some time talking with their archivists, and they were very, very helpful. They directed me to the right place in Venice and was able to get the right people to arrange scans of that whole case file from a witch trial in the 1600s. So that was very interesting. I have the entire case file explaining what the eyewitnesses said that the witches did and all of their records. So that's what's currently occupying my research.
So see, I was right. You are like a secret agent because you're tracking down things, you're driving up with your own equipment, you're getting the runaround from me. This is like a Dan Brown novel almost. I mean, it's very nice.
Well, I actually have another example too. One of the forums, people were saying, why can't we get a reasonably clear diagrams from the 6 and 7 books of Moses? Everybody has published this book for the previous 100 years, and each edition that comes out, it's less and less clear. The artwork is virtually useless. Why can't someone find this? This ended up being more like a Dan Brown story than I expected it to be. I could only track down a couple of copies, and I tried to request from the archivists to loan it out and didn't have much luck. They said that they would send it, and they never did. And anyway, I finally found a copy kind of in my backyard. The University of St. John's here in Minnesota, they happen to have a copy. But when I talked to the archivists, they said they would set it aside so I could come up and look at it. Well, I arrived at the time I designated, and it was nowhere to be found. And the librarian who was there was just about to leave for the day. She'd come in for that morning only. Spent a lot of time looking in all the different possible places, and she finally found it squirreled away in their restoration department. So whoever I talked to originally that said they would set it aside for me to use apparently went and found it and hid it. There was no need for it to be restored. It was in very good condition, but it was just squirreled away. So she let me use it then, and I spent the rest of the day scanning all of that with my scanner. So that's another one of those cases where it just seems like there's obstacles thrown in your way.
No kidding. And you know, this reminds me of a comment. I believe you mentioned this during a talk you gave at the Leaping Laughter Lodge about how there are these undiscovered archives, and there's, I mean, in areas in Europe, there are these undiscovered archives all over the place. And I know Dr. Stephen Skinner has mentioned the same thing, which is, I think he recently mentioned that, you know, there are these grimoires that have never been translated into English that are written in beautiful ecclesiastical Latin and have never been worked. It's like, are there hot spots where you think there might be collections of these things, as you say, kind of squirreled away? Like, is there an archive in Istanbul where you're like, I know there's a really good thing there if I could just get there? Or is there something in Vienna where you're like, I know that this place has something? Or is it just kind of things are just scattered about because of the tides of history and whatnot?
They are scattered about, but these various places, like, for example, the British Library, their catalogs from 100 years ago have relatively vague descriptions of these texts, but there's so many of them. Just the real challenge is not locating them, it's to understand how useful those particular texts are. And as I said, most of these old manuscripts contain more than one text, too, and so the description and how they're cataloged isn't always reflect all of the texts that are in there. And once you get this and start looking through it, it's just overwhelming. Any individual microfilm that I have can have a dozen different texts, and I go through them and I say, oh, I got to get back to this one. This is so interesting. I got to get back to it. But the problem is narrowing down what you want to focus on without getting too distracted by the rest of the material.
Have you ever been in front of a document thinking, oh, this handwriting is terrible. How the heck am I going to... And this is supposed to be in English. How am I supposed to translate it? Like, how do you deal with the actual physical ink on the page, especially when it's might be illegible or it might be, smudged, or, I mean, how do you do that?
When I first get a particular photocopy or microfilm of a manuscript, I tend to write out a grid of letters and what the various forms are that this particular scribe uses. And sometimes the manuscripts are written by more than one scribe, so that can complicate it. But that does help. A lot of times there are words. I mean, there's always words that are easier to decipher, and then you can get a sense of the shape of the letters that they're using. But, after transcribing a bunch of it that way, you get more comfortable with that particular scribe, and you can kind of recognize it. And then that style of handwriting tends to recur other places. So the more manuscripts you look at, the easier it is. So a lot of them are in English, and people can find scans of it or arrange for scans of it and read it. And of course, the language back then can be a little bit different. So there are couple of reference books that I use for understanding some of the archaic English as well as the other languages. Latin, of course, from the Renaissance and Middle Ages was different than classical Latin.
That leads into a beautiful website, and I would really encourage everyone to check out both of your websites. We'll start with esotericarchives.com, because when you started esotericarchives.com, Joe, did you think it would get to this level where so many people are wanting to access it and do access it every day?
No, I was very much surprised at how popular it was. My family refers to it as obscure dead guys. I digitized it because I wanted to be able to search the material on my own computer. When I got my first internet access, it came with a personal website, so I threw it out there so I could access it different places, and I had no idea that it would be so widely referenced. And I see scholarly publications that cite the text in their works as well, so I was just pretty surprised at how much there is.
That kind of dovetails, Joe. We actually have a few listener questions for this podcast, and the first is coming from a fellow author and practicing magician, Aaron Leach, who, again, rightly describes you as the man when it comes to esoteric wisdom and just kind of putting everything together. He was curious, can you ask Joe where he sees esotericarchives.com headed in the future? What is your vision for it? And also, if you can talk about the CD that is built around all the documents and how people can check that out, too.
Let me start with the CD. I put most of the text on the CD plus additional. I originally stayed away from the full text of the Black Magic different works because I didn't want the site to get banned by the various child filters and whatever. So I put outlines of the major Black Magic texts on there and then put it on a CD that people could buy. But most of the stuff that's on the website is on the CD as well. As far as the future of it, it's just kind of been a one-man project where I try and make improvements continually to the text. I know people copy them for their own websites sometimes, and I tend to obsolete my text. As you mentioned, I just made some revisions to Agrippa's fourth book and the Heptameron based on additional texts that I was studying, and so it's usually a good idea if you're interested in those texts to check out the latest versions of them, because I do tend to update them.
Absolutely. In fact, I think you updated the Heptameron, just as a personal side note. I can't remember if it was in late October, early November, but I swear it was just a day before. I was perusing some of the angels of autumn in the Heptameron, and I was like, okay, that says Tolkoret for one of the angels. I swear I think I'm going crazy because I thought it was something else, and then I checked and I found that you had literally gone through like a day later and made these beautiful updates, including you are so good, and I think Aaron Leach has mentioned this to you too. You're so good at catching, for instance, in Turner's translations about, Turner might use a word. An example that comes to mind is, Turner mentioning in the Heptameron that, you will hear hissing from the four quarters of the world. And you said, well, no, this is actually a mistranslation. This is something that Turner might have misinterpreted, that it's actually you should whistle to the four corners of the earth. And you mentioned, for reference, the Sworn Book of Honorius and the really detailed seven-sided whistle construction. When you do that, how does that process go? Is it just where you're kind of checking Turner's Latin and you're checking things and you say, wait a second, this does not check out? Or how does that work?
This kind of gets to the heart of my method. What I really enjoy doing is to try and understand the differences between the source texts and how they influence one another. In this case, I'm working, as I mentioned, this Proto-Grimorium Verum, which I'll refer to as Ars Rabidmadar, and it has some parallels with these Heptameron and Agrippa's fourth book and some other texts, but I was actually going through and comparing to see if it was a direct ancestor, or one versus the other, and looking for variations. And so I'm hunting for variations, and it's sometimes very difficult to find because you tend to see what you think you are seeing, and it's easy to miss a typo or a scribal error when you're comparing the text. But that's kind of what I was doing with both of those texts, and I was able to determine that there were variations between the 1600 edition, which I had been used previously. Actually, it's not 1600, but I was using the Collected Works edition originally. That's what I had transcribed it from, but I had since found earlier texts that had been made available on the various digital archives, and so I was comparing those editions and found the variations, and I was able to determine that Turner had in fact used the Collected Works, or the Opus, Agrippa's Opus, which included as an appendix a number of these related texts.
I think listeners would really appreciate that, because I think that sometimes, I know myself, I will certainly admit, take it for granted. I remember thinking the other day, like, I need to check what ebony wand, I think it has mercurial resonances. Let me just go on Esoteric Archives. And I think people take it for granted that you were there literally cross-referencing, cross-pollinating different resources and organizing all that, whether it's magical resonances or cross-referencing angel names from one area to the other. This leads, Joe, into a question. I received a listener question earlier from Frater Ashton Chassan, Joe, who mentions that, quote, "It is due to Joe's work that I began working from the book and had access to so many classical texts and was actually able to understand them better." So he obviously, being a grimoire traditionalist, ceremonial magician, really credits you. And his question for you, Joe, is, can you ask Joe what fuels and maintains your interest in classical magic, and what is that fire that burns and kind of gives you that energy to tackle all of the meticulous accuracy, double checking, and showing fidelity to the sources? What kind of sustains that passion?
That is a good question. I just find the genre extremely fascinating, and when I'm going through comparing the different manuscripts and texts, and I can make a deduction about what the original intent was or where a particular passage was derived from. So that sense of discovery that is like an aha insight into this document. And it's also, you feel some kind of connection with the original authors or scribes in some of these texts too. So you can feel some sympathy, like this Venetian witch or sorcerer trying to operate in a world that he was in and just trying to understand that whole worldview. To me, it's fascinating, and you get a sense of looking back into their lives.
Is there any practicality? Have you engaged with some of these beautiful historical texts and grimoires in the past or currently?
Well, that's a question I'm sure people are curious about, and I've had people ask it before. I'll have to say the short answer is I don't practice Solomonic magic. However, I will observe that a lot of what's referred to as magic is really a recast of religious practices. And I see this pattern repeated over and over in history, where you have a pocket of magical activity and texts that are generated as a result of the traditional religious authorities being suppressed by new authorities. So you have the Byzantine Greek Orthodox practices in Greece that are like Thuvia to be suppressed when the Romans conquered the area and tried to superimpose Catholicism. And you see the same thing in Renaissance England, where the Catholic Church was banned and the Protestants, they shut down monasteries, and a lot of the traditional practices were suppressed, and a lot of bad press for it. So it comes out as magical practices, but it really was religious practices that are kind of gone underground because people were prevented from practicing it. So from my own standpoint, getting back to that, you mentioned the Avesta.org site, which is Zoroastrian religious text. I really do consider myself a Zoroastrian. I practice traditional Zoroastrian religion, and it does have a lot of overlaps. And I think that, especially in the Talmudic times, there was a lot of cultural exchange between the Zoroastrian community and the Jewish community, and there's a lot of cross-fertilization in that respect. So a number of the traditional religious practices would seem like magical practices in that context too, including the use of a ritual knife, drawing magic furrows, consecrated water, various what would be considered prayers for practical purposes, whether it be healing or other purposes, purification, that sort of thing, are pretty standard parts of the religion.
Can you talk about the relationship exactly between Zoroastrianism and, say, around 100 BC, the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri? Because Dr. Stephen Skinner, for example, traces this transmission of magical techniques, saying that a lot of this stuff can be traced back as early as the post-dynastic Greco-Egyptian days, where there's an Ouroboros, there's a circle of protection, there are phylacteries used, there's a mix of Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish names that are used. What's the relationship with all of that, all of those early quote-unquote Solomonic techniques, with what you just referenced, which is techniques in the Zoroastrian area? Was there any cross-pollination between the Greco-Egyptian and the Zoroastrian, I assume?
Yeah, I think that it's very complicated, the different relationships between the influences, and I think they went back and forth over multiple centuries and different contexts. And so you do see things that can clearly be identified as Zoroastrian references to the deities and spiritual beings and such that are clearly of Zoroastrian ancestry or origin. You see parallel practices. You can't necessarily say that this was like the 9 nights purification, that this directly influenced Key of Solomon's 9-day purification method. Short answer is it's very, very complicated when I've tried to unravel it, and I can't give a simple answer to it. But there's a lot of research that's been done analyzing the different archaeological evidence, and it's fascinating, but it's also a bit overwhelming.
I think when you were talking about tracking down a manuscript about 10 minutes ago, that sometimes you might be focused on one manuscript and all of a sudden there's like a million little whispers in your head. Oh, check this out, check that out. I mean, you could spend 25 lifetimes just going through that. In order to really do it properly, you'd need to learn about 25 more languages. That is very true. Well, to that point, I think this dovetails right into Avesta.org. And I think that there are so many people who are familiar with esoteric archives on the ceremonial magic / grimoire side. Can you kind of talk about if there's someone, Joe, listening out there who, is very well versed in a lot of the grimoire side of things? Can you, and you were touching on this earlier, can you talk about the importance of Zoroastrianism, not only as you say, a living, breathing religion, but also those really important influences that might have affected the grimoiric and the Greek and the Greco-Egyptian techniques. It just sounds like, Avesta.org just has a lot of really good knowledge out there.
There's a lot of information on the website, different traditional documents that I found very fascinating and relevant to some of these esoteric threads. Some of the traditional prayer guides and things like that is done in the Avesta language, so I have all of the Avesta texts that are not going to be as much of interest to the esoteric community as they would to a practicing Zoroastrian, but translations, a lot of them have fascinating content that's kind of relevant to it. It's a little bit like the Hermetica, the Hermetic treatises. They are not mainstream esoteric or grimoiric sources, but they're fascinating by themselves and kind of complement your knowledge of the whole ancient world and religious practices, spiritual practices.
In a world with an ever shorter attention span, and you're thinking of, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's TV shows, this and that, can you just talk about the real importance of grimoiric scholarship, esoteric scholarship, and really not only showing fidelity to the sources, but really making sure that these things are documented properly? Why is that so important, especially in 2017?
My perspective might be a little bit different than the average practitioner, but first of all, I think the whole process of doing critical thinking and textual analysis based on textual criticism is important, and I see, especially with the short attention spans, as you mentioned, a shortage of critical thinking, and people will just automatically accept something they see and not question it. My whole process has kind of been one long exercise in critical thinking, where I'm trying to see what a text that I read really means, because it doesn't make, a particular passage doesn't make sense. Example, in the 6 and 7 books of Moses, there's many passages that just don't make sense. And going back to the original German, it's like, oh, okay, I see what the original text said. I don't understand why the original translator got it so garbled, but then you can, kind of understand where some of this stuff came from.
When it comes to magical research and scholarship and everything, the formulas, tracking things down, driving up in your car with your own equipment, which is just awesome, what do you think are the biggest 2 or 3 things that most people on the outside do not understand about magical or esoteric research and scholarship? I mean, what are the 2 or 3 big things that you wish people might understand a little bit more when it comes to the kinetics of what you do every day?
First of all, we touched on this a couple of times already, but just the vast amount of source material out there. It's kind of unfortunate, I think, to some extent, that people keep going back to and reprinting the same materials over and over and propagating the same concepts over and over without bothering to look at the original materials and trying to understand it better. And a good example, again, from the 6, 7 books of Moses, there was a book published by Anna Riva, and I don't know anything about the works, Anna Riva's works at all, but it was a supplement to the 6 and 7 books of Moses, where a lot of information was put down based on the one English translation, and she never really went back to the original sources to get better drawings, or did things like, one of the prayers that was in there was a fairly standard Hebrew liturgical prayer that's recited in the synagogues, and she mistook that to be a list of angel names and kind of propagated that misunderstanding. People buy the text and based on her pulling it from the English edition, which is very unclear. So just the whole idea of, there's a lot of material out there, and people should look at it and with a critical eye and try and understand what it's really about and what other materials are available.
Can you kind of talk about how do you see the kind of, I guess you could say, spiritual organization of the universe? You know, it's a very broad question, but for example, just to give some context, Dr. Stephen Skinner mentions that, you know, there's this psychological model that has constantly tried to be placed for the last 100 years, ever since Crowley wrote that the goetic spirits are portions of the human brain, that there's this very psychological based model, and Skinner refutes that in the Source Works of Ceremonial Magic series, saying that there is some kind of, you know, objective relationship that is had. And I guess I'm curious from your perspective, as you said, engaging with the Zoroastrian aspects, do you see that in a similar vein in terms of the kind of objective nature of these things in a Zoroastrian context?
Even aside from the Zoroastrian context, I absolutely do believe in non-physical beings, and I've seen enough things and had enough things happen to where I am 100% convinced that there are non-physical beings, and they're not just aspects of our personality or psychic powers that are lurking out there. That may also be the case, but specifically in a Zoroastrian context, one difference with the Grimoire traditions, to a large extent as understood these days, is I definitely am a dualist, and in the sense that I believe that there's good spirits, evil spirits, and that you don't mess with the evil spirits. The Grimoire tradition deals with them quite extensively and stuff, but you know, I think this is one thing that would probably differentiate me from a lot of the practitioners. It's just, I believe people have a unfortunate tendency to ignore the existence of evil, and that's basically why I consider myself Zoroastrian, is I think it has the best solution to the whole dilemma of the existence of evil. So that's kind of hopefully answers both sides of the question.
As you know, there's been countless discussions where someone might say, in a grimoire context even, saying, oh, you don't need a circle of protection, you can just engage in a goetic operation, and you know, the circle isn't really needed, and then other people, I know Dr. Skinner is among them, saying like, no, these are objective beings, and it's a bit like, and I think he was quoting Iamblichus, talking about these are almost like you're dealing with very powerful spiritual, almost like wild animals, where you have to use some kind of protection, and yet other people will jump in and say, no, you don't need that, and then they kind of almost border on the psychological model of things. I mean, is that kind of what you're talking about really being grounded in that dualism, like there is good and there is evil?
Yeah, I think this is very clear in the older sources, especially, and I'll cite the Sworn Book of Honorius. Certain classes of spirits are terrestrial in nature, and you have to construct a circle to protect yourself. The higher spirits, planetary spirits, and the angels, you don't need the protection against those, so the circles are not used in that respect. But definitely with the more goetic spirits and the terrestrial spirits, you want that barrier.
Absolutely. And you know, when you read the Heptameron, it seems to have this dichotomy within it. On the one hand, it's very Catholic and very, you are the exorcist and you need a circle of protection, and these are aerial kings or possibly Arabic jinn. When they're invoked before you, there is this deference and respect. You know, welcome, O genies, welcome, O most noble princes. And so can you kind of talk about that, Joe, in terms of there is this good and evil dichotomy, but yet there is this kind of deference, respect shown. Is that a departure from the Zoroastrian aspect, or is it similar? It's
interesting you mention it. The word jinn is actually an Avestan term. It's not Arabic. The Avestan form of that is Jaini or Jaina. There are different variations of it in the more modern languages, but it does go back to a Zoroastrian Avestan concept of these spirits, and they were kind of associated in some of the texts with stars and meteors moving through the sky. It corresponds quite well with the modern fairies in that respect, although some of the Avesta scholars translate it as witch. It's clear that it's not a human entity at all. It's a supernatural being, and so to translate it as witch is a very misleading, unfortunate practice. But yeah, so the Heptameron itself has a very complicated relation to the other texts. I know that the Byzantine exorcism manual that I referred to in the Sworn Book of Honorius has a later date on it, but I think it points to the fact that given the forms are a little bit clearer in that text, there was a common source that goes back prior to the 1300s. And it'd be interesting to find additional examples of that, but I don't understand at this point. I haven't been able to piece together the exact relationship between all of those sources.
They do seem to borrow from one another with the invocations and certain Latin elements to it.
I think that the point of where they departed is unclear because we don't have enough examples to really piece it together, because those are so old and it's a lot harder to research documents of that era as well.
One of the first things that you touched on was obviously something you are deeply involved in right now, and I wanted to ask you, and my pronunciation's horrible, so please correct me, but is one of the current projects you're working on the Secrets of Solomon and the Ars Rabidmadar?
I need a better working title for this for when I print it. I've been working on it actually pretty much from the very beginning. One of the first books I ever read on magic was Waite's Book of Ceremonial Magic, and he goes through and has a section on Grimorium Verum and mentions that the Latin exemplars of that seem to have a more full treatment of the text. But I got to thinking about that. I actually looked at the Italian edition before I saw the French edition. At the time I was in London, someone had stolen the copy out of the British Library, so it wasn't available to consult. It was later recovered, and I was able to get microfilms of the French text. But I put together a comparison of the text, and I originally thought that the Latin, or the Italian rather, was the more original text, kind of misled by Waite's statements to that effect. But I actually was able to determine that the French was the more original. But there's problems with the French edition of it. By the way, Grimorium Verum is by far the most popular of all the texts that I have published.
Oh, really?
Probably sells more copies than all the rest of the books combined for whatever reason. And Waite and Idries Shah and others have mentioned the fact that it has a surprising amount of popularity for it. It's a short text, but it has a lot of problems with it. It refers to artwork that isn't included in the book. It's disjointed in some respects. It refers to things that are supposed to be used later but are never referred to again. So this project really came about as me trying to fill in those gaps and understand how to make sense of all this material. So I have eventually found this reference in a German book about Faust by an author named Kiesewetter, and they had a copy when I was researching Arbatel, they had a copy of this at the University of Madison, and Kiesewetter has quotes from this Ars Rabidmadar text, which to me clearly was Latin equivalent of what the introduction and some of the sections of the Grimorium Verum. So I tracked that back to Adelung, who had published kind of an encyclopedic work on mental health, and he had examples of quotes from a number of grimoires in there, but eventually was able to track down manuscripts, including Adelung's original source manuscript that he was quoting from. So that's kind of gone full circle too. But yeah, that's the one I've been researching. It's taken me into Pseudo-Agrippa, back into Heptameron. It actually quotes from Pseudo-Agrippa and the secret archives and the archives of the Venetian Inquisition. So it's been a very fascinating project for me.
Can they look for that later on either esotericarchives.com or in a book issuance from you that they can pick up later, maybe?
One of the main manuscripts is this Polish manuscript, and I have a transcription of that, which, of course, is in Latin, but it has the artwork. I've translated the chapter titles so people can understand, what the particular chapter's about, and the list of spirits should be pretty easy to understand. But I was originally hoping to have it in print by the end of this year, but the fact that I found this Gerald Gardner manuscript and then the Venetian archive manuscript and now the Dresden manuscript, I've been able to greatly expand my analysis of the text and I think reconstruct a pretty decent critical edition based on that. So hopefully within the next 12 months, I should have that in print.
Yes, we'll definitely keep our eyes open for that. And I'm going to vaguely blame Jake Stratton Kent for the amount of sales of the Grimoire Verum that keep coming out. And I don't know, Joe, I just thought of this, but do you think that some of the allure of the Grimoire Verum is, that it does border on that kind of darker side of the grimoiric experience, whereas a book on the opposite spectrum, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, would be the Arbitel, which is a very positive grimoire. There's it's one of the most optimistic grimoires you could read, and then the Grimoire Verum. Do you think that might be why? Because it just seems more dangerous, or?
I think you're right. I think that people have a fascination for that, and it's kind of fuels a lot of media and movies and television stuff, the fascination with the nature of evil, and I think that's definitely part of it.
Last two questions, and I've got one final listener question from Frater Ashton Chasan, who said, to ask Joe, what does Joe feel is of the most benefit and use that classical magic can lend to the modern day? And we kind of touched on this with the short attention span and all that, but I guess for listeners out there, what are like the two or three big things that you want them to really just keep in mind about esoteric research and about classical magic in particular, and about its historic place in the zeitgeist?
I think the fact that one person's magic is another person's religion. People are also starved for ritual. I think there's a lot of people who dismiss ritual as being a negative thing, but when it comes right down to it, the way we're constructed, the human beings, we rely on different hacks to get through life, and ritual is one of them. It also kind of is a challenge to authority, which means people should be able to use critical thinking to assess the authorities that they're trusting and whether it's leading them down a good path or a bad path. So
that is very valuable stuff to keep in mind, and I really hope our listeners also will benefit from that. And that kind of leads into one of the last things, Joe, which is, you talked about from the dualist perspective of a Zoroastrian and kind of the Zoroastrian theology, and there is good and there is evil. Can you talk about how that dichotomy relates to things when it comes to building relationships with spirits? For example, I know Aaron Leach is very big in the grimoiric context of offerings to spirits, specific altars with the specific planetary incenses, and building relationships there. Can you talk about, does that kind of approach agree with the dichotomy with the Zoroastrianism? Is there that kind of relationship building in the Zoroastrian context?
There are different prayers that are associated with the different spiritual beings, and in Zoroastrianism, each month of the year and each day of the month is associated with a particular spiritual being. So you have essentially 30 spiritual beings, one for each day of the month, and 12 of those are also coinciding with the month of the year. Practice, of course, varies, but it's not uncommon for people to develop a particular relationship or appreciation or the feeling that they have a special relationship with a particular being. And an example I've seen is someone gets into a very serious accident or almost gets into a very serious accident, but they're rescued kind of miraculously. They'll associate that day of the month with a particular being, and they'll say special prayers for that being and feel that that's really kind of their patron. That kind of thing is fairly common, but there are also different practices associated with them. One example and maybe this is getting too far off track, but on the day that's associated with Aben, which is a spiritual being associated with the water, and the month of Aben, it's very traditional to write out a charm or a prayer, what's referred to as a nirang, that is put by the door as a kind of like a Jewish mezuzah. There are specific practices for specific days and times of the month, times of the day. Even there's 5 different periods of the day. So
that is fascinating. One thinks back to the Heptameron being one of the few grimoires that prescribes different seasons, different names for the angels of the season, different names for the sun and the moon. All that seems to kind of dovetail. Joe, I'm wondering too, is there a place in Zoroastrianism for, like when you pick up George Denn's book about the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage and the holy guardian angel, is there some kind of relationship with a being that is there throughout your entire life that you should connect with?
Yes, I actually believe that this is a Zoroastrian concept, an original Zoroastrian concept that has influenced the other religions. In Zoroastrianism, it's referred to as a Farohar or a Fravashi in the Avestan language. In the Middle Persian, it's Farohar, which you probably would more likely run into. But the Fravashi is often symbolized by a winged creature said to be able to travel from the heavens to the earth, and they have a special relationship with an individual. So each individual has a Fravashi or a guardian spirit, a guardian angel. So this is one of the traditional practices that the prayers include the prayers to the guardian angels.
How cool is that? That is something I hope our listeners really enjoy that, and will research into that as well. That is so cool. Is there anything else that you want our listeners to kind of maybe keep an eye out for in 2018, or any changes to both of your websites, anything at all that you want them to know about?
I have a lot of different projects in various states of completion. There isn't any one specifically that I would point out.
There's never just one thing that you're working on, is there? There's probably just a plethora of different things that want to claim your attention every day.
There's a lot of loose ends with the various things I did. You mentioned some of the texts, I've partially translated as part of my research into a particular text like Rabid Madar, and plan to go back at some point and do a more full treatment of it or version of it.
Absolutely. Well, we will certainly keep our ears to the ground on that as always. Joseph Peterson, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time and coming on the Glitch Bottle podcast today. We really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, I enjoyed talking with you, and if you have any follow-up questions, let me know. As always, the websites are there. People can find my email address based on that, or some of the forums that I participate in. A lot of interesting questions. I've referred to some of the practices that the people are involved in some of the books, and that's helpful for me to understand what people are doing and how it's working for them.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Glitch Bottle Podcast and helping us uncork the uncommon this fine day or night, or wherever you happen to occupy space-time in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or your cloistered libraries of the esoterically awesome. You can check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and you can download episodes on our blog, glitchbottle.blogspot.com. Please make sure also to subscribe and follow us on YouTube, and also you can follow us on Twitter at GlitchBottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.